Hello, my name is Francine Hermelin-Levitt, and I'm Reboot's Chief Network Officer and Head of Programming for Reboot Ideas. Welcome to the kickoff of a fantastic fall season. For 20 years, Reboot has been gathering cultural thought leaders for uncensored conversations about Jewish identity and meaning. With Reboot Ideas, we lift the curtain on these conversations, inviting more participants to the table to reflect the ever-growing voices and issues shaping our future. We believe that integral to the human experience is a constant questioning of who we are, where we sit, and what we do within our society as Jews, as citizens, as inhabitants of the planet. We are reckoning with the identities and ties we've inherited: family, land, rituals, social systems. Reboot Ideas Fall 2021 offers a series of conversations between artists, writers, musicians, doctors, and strategists that boldly examine the hot button issues of our day. We'll dive into the gray spaces and together experience the power of dialogue to propel us forward, evolve the Jewish experience, and transform society. Over the next few months, join us. Click on the link in the chat to sign up, both physically and virtually. Okay, a quick note of housekeeping. We will save the last 15 minutes of today for audience questions, so please put those into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It's private, only for the speakers. The chat feature is public for all of us to see, so you can reserve that for cheers or comments. So, without further ado, let's get to today's conversation. Can we talk about Israel? A guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted. A great frame for the conversation we're having, and the title of Daniel Sokatch's book, Dropping Today. The book's title grasps how fraught it is to have a productive conversation about Israel, which throws off electrical charges at every turn. To counter this, there's a light conversational touch to the book, augmented by the wonderful and often whimsical illustrations of Christopher Knoxon. So quick background on Daniel and Juliette, although I'm sure you all know who they are. Daniel Sokatch has served as the CEO of the New Israel Fund since 2009. During the past decade of extraordinary challenges, NIF has risen to new heights as the great defender of justice, democracy, and equality in Israel. Before joining NIF, Daniel served as the executive director of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco and surrounding areas. Prior to that, he was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, now Bend the Arc. He's been named 4 times to the Forward 50, the annual list of the 50 leading Jewish decision makers and opinion shapers, and has contributed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, among others. He also sits on the Reboot board. And all of that is to say, Daniel is the person we need to meet this moment with the perspective and nuance it requires, with whom we all need to be talking about Israel. And we are so fortunate because Daniel has brought with him in conversation Professor Juliette Kayyem, CNN national security analyst, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. She serves as a faculty chair of Harvard's Kennedy School. Juliette was formerly President Obama's Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and before that, Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor, managing complex policy initiatives and organizing government responses to major crises. So we could not be guided by better people today as we welcome Daniel and congratulate him on this fantastic book and welcome him to this critical moment in time. So Daniel, Juliette, take it away.
Thank you, Francine, and I hope everyone is well. First of all, Daniel, congratulations on an exciting day. COVID keeps us from being together for these big events, but given the numbers I'm seeing at the corner, there's not rooms big enough, even when we don't have a pandemic, that could hold this crowd. I think it's a testament not only to your friends and those who love you, but also those who have come to know you through your tremendous work. So I want to say congratulations and to thank Reboot for having me as well. For those of you who don't know Daniel, or why would you? Daniel and I have been friends for a very long time. And I feel like this title was written for me because often I would probably answer in the no. Can we talk about Israel? Do we have to, right? And I think maybe many of us feel that way depending on where we are and our audience. My parents are from Lebanon, and I am married to a Reboot alumni, and raising kids in an interfaith marriage. And so Israel has often been the issue one shall not discuss. But Daniel went there and brilliantly. And so I want to begin with the first question. The book is I should tell readers, you should all be readers and purchasers, don't just be readers, that the book is really comprehensive. We're going to highlight a few moments in the book, but I have to ask the sort of quintessential question, which is, why this book now?
Well, first of all, thank you, Juliette, for that warm welcome, and Francine and Reboot. It's really great to be here with my community on this launch day. Juliette, you've written plenty of books, so you're used to this. But for me, this is the first time, and so it's exciting, even though we can't be in the same place physically, to be able to be with the Reboot community and the broader Reboot interested community, and especially with you, Juliette, to talk about this. So why this book now? Look, for many, many years, a lot of people, most importantly my wife, have been telling me, you really ought to write a book about Israel. And what I would traditionally respond to this with was, if I were to write a book about Israel, it would be called Israel, WTF, Why One Small Country Drives So Many People Nuts. And in a way, this book is really an attempt to do that in a more serious way. There are really two broad groups of books. There are a lot of books about Israel, which is implied in your question, Juliette. And I sometimes think of them as existing in two big categories. One are advocacy pieces, right, which can go from sort of lightly flavored advocacy pieces to all-out polemics for one side or the other. Sometimes these are books that make their objectives really clear. Alan Dershowitz wrote a book years ago called something like The Case for Israel. So there you go. But lots of times, these are books that put themselves forward as more balanced or neutral, but really are pursuing a particular position. And whereas my book pursues a particular position, it is one that is pretty balanced in terms of its recognizing that both sides to this conflict have real legitimate claims. Both sides are real legitimate victims of themselves, of each other, of the world, and both sides deserve to be listened to. The other big category of books suffer from inaccessibility, right? They're books that are written by scholars, for scholars, by experts, for experts. Some of them are great, and I used many of them for this book. Deep dives into some of the specific issues and minutiae of the conflict. I wanted this book to be neither of those things, to be an accessible guide to people who exhibit Reboot-like characteristics, right? That is to say, they're open-hearted, open-minded, curious, skeptical, and not afraid to wade in to try to understand something.
And so there's something about deciding to write the book then in that way, and now in particular, and we'll end the conversation about sort of Israel now, but there's an interesting part or aspect to your book, which is the how you wrote it. For people who don't have the book yet, today is the day. It's visual. It has design and graphics and pictures. There are testimonials by you about your experience at a certain time or at a certain visit. The footnotes are sort of reflections and conversation. There's a how to it. Does that relate to the sort of why you wanted to write the book? That it was that something about that way of presenting it seemed consistent with the sort of why you wrote it?
Yeah, 100%, because of that second category of accessibility, and also that first one of like polemics. I really felt like the approach of the book had to be one that was conversational. It's some of the people who blurbed the book. Juliette blurbed the book, by the way, and answered the question the very way she answered it earlier, which is, do we have to talk about Israel? And now look, you do, you have to. But I was really attempting to have this conversation in a way that felt like we were having dinner together, or a way that felt like we were chatting without the landmines, the emotional, political, social, religious landmines that tend to litter the field when people talk about this. I wanted to, no pun intended, or maybe I do intend it, to disarm the conversation in that way. And the great idea, which again was my wife's, of asking my dear friend Chris Knox and fellow rebooter to do the illustrations was another attempt to sort of make the book more accessible, not easier, but more engaging, more beautiful even, which I think he really, really did. And I have to give a shout out to my amazing publishers team at Bloomsbury, because even the design of the book, more than I ever could have hoped for, I feel like is engaging and makes you want to pick it up and read it, or at least I hope it does. But so yes, that the how was explicitly intentional in relationship to what I was trying to do.
I want to, in a moment, I'm going to turn to certain dates over the course of it. One of the challenges, or the reason why my inclination would be vote, I don't want to talk about this, and we'll both be personal here. I'm raising my kids in the Jewish faith. Is that it's the separating, disarming the emotion of what Israel means. Is in itself seems to me to be a political decision on your part, and that's maybe Israel is also it's a sentiment, it's an emotion, it's lots of things. How are you able to do that? Because that is often one of the reasons why people don't want to talk about it. It's just it becomes too emotional.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's funny because as you were saying that, I was thinking if people are tuning in to see an Arab American and a Jewish American talk about Israel, like that's a spectacle enough in and of itself. But I mean, and maybe we're trying to also exemplify how you can talk about Israel. Right. But look, I think that Israel is so hard for people to talk about for a lot of really good reasons, and I sort of go into this in the book, and part of it is, there's the old parable of the blind men and the elephant, and each one sort of feels the part of the elephant and is sure that that's what the elephant is. Well, I mean, a lot of things in life are like that, which is why that's a parable. But Israel in particular is like that, and so many of us have, this kind of received story that we know to be true, right? We know that what we know is the truth, and in fact, at best, it's usually a partial truth, or even a part of a partial truth. And so the book, so for me, for lots of reasons, which we can go into, but which probably go back in a funny way to spending a lot of time in Northern Ireland at the time when I was really coming into my own as a college student, thinking hard about Israel, which I'd sort of fallen in love with years before in high school, and actually learning about and making comparisons to those two situations, and recognizing that, well, there's a bigger picture here, just as there is in the north of Ireland, where an outsider like me would not assume that one side was right and one side was wrong. So too, when it came to Israelis and Palestinians, Arabs and Israelis, I realized at a certain point, wait a minute, I have received one narrative, and that's not the whole story. And so I made it kind of my work, my life's work, to try to understand the many different sides of the story. And so that is why I think it's so important to try to, you called it sort of depoliticize, I guess, or it's a political conversation, but even more, it's like an emotional, personal, religious conversation. And I think like getting yourselves into the place of empathy and understanding and open-heartedness is necessary to navigate this correctly.
So I want to go now to the history of Israel, because the book brings us across a long chronology. But there's three dates that really stood out to me as sort of moments that are worth talking about. I'm not going to get all of them, everyone. So, but three at least to me that I want to start with. The first is after the creation of Israel, and is 1967, the 6-Day War. If you were to think about that moment, what was that moment about? What was that war about? And why does it have such how did it change Israel?
Well, I think you're right to pick that as the first date, the first sort of pivotal date after the founding of Israel itself, because, I would argue that is a date upon which the hinge of history actually turns when it comes to Israel and the Middle East, but really, the world that we live in today. You can't see it from where I'm sitting in the office, but I have on the wall of the office an old Life magazine cover. I read about this in the book, and Chris did a great job drawing it. But it's a cover from June 1967 of Life magazine showing an Israeli soldier in the Suez Canal, having stormed through the Sinai after Israel preemptively attacked its Arab neighbors who were preparing for an invasion, it seemed, of Israel, massing their troops at the border, demanding that the United Nations leave the the Sinai Peninsula, with belligerent radio broadcasts coming out of Cairo and Amman and Damascus saying they pushed the Jews to the sea. So Israel, early one June morning, launches an attack, wipes out the Egyptian Air Force and the Syrian Air Force. The war commences. And 6 days later, Israel's in control of territory many, many times its original size. And this includes territory in which millions and millions of Palestinians live, right, many of whom had fled from what is Israel proper, right, in 1948. So that moment is so pivotal. And the picture on my wall was so powerful to me because, as a younger person, I saw that picture of that beautiful, handsome Israeli soldier, and it was so romantic. And I remember the headline on the magazine was like the amazing wrap up to an astounding war. And as like a 19-year-old college kid, I thought that was pretty cool. And as I got older, I sort of got less and less comfortable with this image and with that headline because it's war at the end of the day, however just, however understandable. And as I got older still and learned more, I actually realized that photograph, which had seemed to me to be a snapshot of this moment of Israel's great promise, was actually a snapshot of the moment when Israel set down a path that I believe is an existential threat to its future as a liberal democracy. And that is the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. There were many other territories, but let's talk about those. And the subsequent settlement enterprise that began days after the war, which has resulted now in almost 700,000 Israeli Jewish civilians having been moved into territory that Israel conquered in the Six-Day War, which is in violation of the Fourth Geneva Conventions, which says that you can't do those things. So that moment of the war, as symbolized by that picture, was both the moment of Israel's greatest triumph, right, over its enemies, the beginning of like a whole new way that not only Israel, but Jews thought of themselves and of Jewish history. Mm-hmm. Like the eternal victim was now this proud, strong, tough, Jew in the world, but it was also the beginning of the really seemingly intractable, nightmarish reality in which Israel finds itself mired, again, compromising its own standing as a democratic country in the world. So that's why 67 is absolutely right as your first choice.
Okay, before I get to my second, though, can you tie for the listeners sort of 67 then with the Yom Kippur War?
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, that then presents a different narrative, but the same sort of sense of Israel Israel as a Middle Eastern country with neighbors that it is at war with.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, sort of sadly and not surprisingly to anyone who's interested enough to be on this Zoom call, you could have picked any number of dates, right? And it's very, very likely that the dates that you picked would have been dates that coincided with the war Israel fought with one or more of its neighbors, right? Yeah. Because the history of the region since Israel's establishment, which again, the moment of Israel's establishment, the War of Independence, the salvation of a huge part of the Jewish population on the planet, is the same moment that is in Arabic, the Nakba, the catastrophe of displacement and disenfranchisement and exile of millions of Palestinians. So both of those things are true, which is like a metaphor for the book. So you go from 48 to 67, and then you go from 67 to 73. And this is an Israel for that, those 6 years or so, this is an Israel that is like intoxicated, understandably, with this extraordinary, unprecedented in modern Jewish history victory, right? Like suddenly they're bestride the world. They're like the kings of the Middle East, and they're exploring these territories, and they're driving to the markets in Jericho, and they're going down to the beach in Sinai and skiing up in the mountains in the Golan, right? And the world sort of is opened up to Israel because of the conquest of these territories. And although Israel very quickly says, we will exchange land for peace, it adopts policies that make that questionable to many people, especially in the West Bank, as they begin building settlements, which they also do in the Sinai, in Gaza, and in the Golan, right? And the Israelis are living large. The Arabs are sort of shattered. The president of Egypt, who provoked the Six-Day War, Nasser, the great pan-Arabist, it ultimately kind of fades away, dies of a heart attack, disappears from the scene. And onto the scene comes a new president in Egypt, a guy called Anwar Sadat. And he is a very canny and clever politician. And he understands that that to make the Israelis listen and to make the world listen, in order to get them to do what he wants, which is to give back the Sinai and ultimately make peace with the neighbors, there needs to be a short, sharp shock. And so the Israelis are not paying attention to what is happening as Sadat prepares a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, the Jewish holy day, 1973. Egyptian troops storm across the Suez Canal. They push the Israelis back in the Sinai. Syrian forces storm the Golan, pushing Israelis almost off the Golan Plateau. And ultimately, Israel regains its footing and wins the war with an American airlift, President Nixon airlifts aid. But this, even though like we understand the war is another Israeli victory, they're mostly Israeli victories, although not all. This war is a shock to the Israelis, just as Sadat supposed, and in ways that he didn't suppose. In ways that he did suppose, right? It opened the door ultimately for Israelis to say, okay, we will exchange land for peace when it comes to the Sinai in Egypt, which of course, ultimately they do at Camp David, Jimmy Carter's great triumph. But the other shock that it does to the Israeli system is it shakes the foundations of people's faith in the institutions that they had taken since Israel's establishment, and maybe even before, they had taken for granted in terms of being the great institutions that were leading the people in the nation, specifically the army, the intelligence apparatus, and really importantly, the Labor Party, the Socialist Zionist Labor Party that had founded not just the country, but the pre-state organizing for half a century before Israel was established. Only labor or socialist Zionist parties had been in power at that point in Israel's history. But a few years after 73, in large part because of 73, there was what is called the revolution or the earthquake in Hebrew, and Menachem Begin becomes the first right-wing Likud prime minister. And since that time, power has gone back and forth, but there's never been. Yeah. So.
Okay, so let's fast forward then, because then so basically you're describing now the period in between back and forth of parties. But so 1995, and I remember, there's moments where you think all is lost, the Rabin assassination. And to remind people, this is after a peace deal with Arafat, but also the Jordanians. Many people forget. So now there's two neighbors that have some sort of written, who knows how they would have unfolded, but Rabin gets assassinated by a right-wing student, religious student. And this date, then, I guess my question is, has Israel ever recuperated from this date, and has the world?
Right. Well, the short answer to that is, in my opinion, no, it hasn't. And we're coming up on the anniversary of that assassination in early November. Wow. I lived in Israel at that time, and it's you picked 95, and you could have picked 93 to make a similar point, which was when that sort of halcyon golden moment began in Israel. When the Oslo Accord was signed on the White House lawn, and me in Boston thought I gotta get over there because it seemed like there was the great denouement of history, or at least a part of history happening. Right. And I lived in Israel. I actually came back to start grad school about 4 weeks before the assassination of Rabin. And I do think that and I make the point in the book that is another pivot upon which history turned. And it may turn out to be, so far, it has in fact turned out to be, that rarest of political assassinations, right? One that totally succeeds in its objective, right? Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and of course we know that Reconstruction in many ways fails as a result of that, and we have 100 years of Jim Crow, but the progress of the Civil War is not utterly lost, right? Like the institution of slavery is ended and the Union is preserved, and Martin Luther King is assassinated, and the civil, and we lose perhaps the greatest American in modern history, but the civil rights movement itself and the long march towards equality and freedom in this country, while suffering, is not ended, right? And the same thing with the projects that the Kennedys were trying to do, and Mahatma Gandhi. Usually assassinations don't utterly change the course of history. And when it comes to Rabin, it may be that the assassin, as you put it, an ultra right-wing Jewish religious law student, may have succeeded in his objective, which was to destroy the possibility that there would be a two-state solution, to destroy the possibility that Israel would ever withdraw the Jewish settlements from the West Bank and from East Jerusalem and from other parts of the territories. Now, it's true that years later, Ariel Sharon, a prime minister who was a right-winger, and in many ways the grandfather of the settlement enterprise, is the guy who pulls the settlers out of Gaza. But when it comes to what Yigal Amir, the name of the assassin, was trying to accomplish, thus far, he has succeeded because since, there were fits and starts for another 5 or 6 years, but since that day in 1995, there has not been, or certainly since the end of 2000, 2001, there has not been a serious peace process that looked like it might arrive at the two-state solution that ultimately, even though it was largely unspoken in those early days, people saw as the ultimate goal. Ehud Olmert, a prime minister who succeeded Sharon, tried to resuscitate that, but he was swept out of power and ended up in jail for corruption charges. And the rest is, as they say, at least so far, history. So 95 is a pretty dark pivot upon which history is turning.
Well, from my opinion, it gets darker. In 2009, Netanyahu is he reelected? He's elected.
So yeah, Netanyahu, right. Shimon Peres succeeds Rabin, and we won't get too into the weeds. And if you're interested, read the book. I promise it won't be boring.
There's a lot of prime ministers.
There's a lot of them.
Quickly.
So
they're all Netanyahu by the end.
Well, at a certain point, although not anymore, they're all Netanyahu. So right, so Peres succeeds Rabin and hoping to capitalize on sympathy for Rabin and for the peace process, he calls an election which he by a hair loses after a series of horrific terrorist attacks against Israelis and a really botched attack on your parents' homeland, Lebanon. And so Peres loses, and there's Bibi Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is universally known as Bibi, which is a funny name for a guy like that. But in any event, Bibi comes to power. He is then defeated. He's a failed first-time prime minister, interestingly, and he's swept in. There's a landslide, and Ehud Barak comes to power explicitly to finish Rabin's legacy. And as I said, that's sort of the last great moment of hope, but he fails and he is succeeded by Sharon, and Sharon falls into a coma. He is succeeded by Olmert, who serves for very short period of time, gets involved in the second invasion of Lebanon, second Lebanon war, has at one point an approval rating of 3%, is removed from office by who, Bibi Netanyahu, and until May, June of this year, that's who's ruled Israel ever since.
And Netanyahu represents essentially also the settlements. I mean, essentially the sort of pushing of the settlements for the last 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be fair to paint him as the only person who's pushed the settlements. And at certain points, there were far more sort of ideologically extreme proponents of the settlement enterprise. And Bibi, for example, during the Obama presidency, would play this interesting game of sort of saying, well, I would love to, do more for you, settler lobby, but I just can't because Obama won't let me. Then when Trump comes to power, Trump sort of says, not sort of, the Trump peace plan, which includes a green light for Israel to begin unilateral annexation. And Netanyahu has thrown red meat at his base for years, saying if reelected in these 4 elections that happen in rapid succession, I will start annexing. So yeah, by the end, he becomes, as you said, Mr. Settlement, Mr. Annexation. Although interestingly, in that window of opportunity that he has to do what he promised he would do, which is annex in the West Bank, thus obviating the possibility of a two-state solution, and in my opinion, damning Israel to a future that can't be democratic anymore, and would be characterized by a term that we'll probably talk about later on in this conversation, but it's neither Hebrew nor Arabic nor English, rather Afrikaans, right? He's got the green light to do it by Trump. He's said he's going to do it. He's got a majority government or a coalition that's in power, and he doesn't do it. And the reason he doesn't do it, if you apply Occam's razor to the situation, you would say that the Abraham Initiative, the Accords rather, the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain give him the ladder with which he needs to descend, from which, that gives him the ability to get out of the tree he has put himself up in with no way of getting down. And it's a way out of this promise. And the reason he doesn't want to keep this promise is because it's a disaster. Because if you start to annex the West Bank, as his right-wing base wants, and you don't extend the vote to the 2.5 or more million Palestinians living there, amidst 650 or 700,000 settlers, then you're no longer a democracy, right? You're something else entirely. So he was Mr. Settlement, and he continues to expand them. But even Bibi, given the green light to begin annexing, doesn't begin annexing, which is very interesting for all of us.
Right. And that's sort of where we are now. We'll talk about the current events, and also I'll begin to take Q&As in about 15 minutes. But hopefully this is answering a lot of your questions. So we're going to get to some hard parts now about Jewish American groups and the political influence of discourse here, next generation stuff. So, okay, so I want to start with you said something with this. Israel would no longer be a democracy. So make the case to lots of people who see where Israel is, and everyone knows I am reflecting a not minority sentiment, including amongst Jewish Americans, that Israel is an apartheid state in all but name.
Right. So one of the things
told you we get to the controversy.
Hey, I wrote it in the book. I figured we were going to talk about it. And the reason I wrote about it in the book, I call that chapter the A word, right? Yeah. Is because it's such a difficult, like other initials that I address in the book, BDS, right? Anti-Semitism, yeah. The other A word. These are things that are incredibly difficult for us to talk about, especially within the Jewish community, but also beyond. Look, I mean, the Economist magazine, right? The Economist has a democracy index that they release every year. And for years now, for like a decade, Israel or more, basically coterminous with Bibi's time as prime minister, Israel has been ranked as a flawed democracy, not a full democracy. Guess who else is a flawed democracy the last 4 or 5 years or so, right? We are ranked as a flawed democracy. You know, for my Canadian and British and Irish friends who are listening to this, you're all full democracies, as are most of the Western European and Northern European and Australia, New Zealand countries, but not us and not Israel. And so, this is something that is hard for many people to grapple with. Right. In a way, for some of us, it's easier to say, oh, yeah, I get that America is not a full democracy. We're a flawed democracy. We look at the electoral, college, look at the problem we have with the Senate and representation. I get it. The attempt by one of our political parties to prevent people from voting. But in Israel, there are different but similarly systemic flaws in the system that keep it from being a full democracy. And of course, one of those things is the now 54-year-old occupation of the West Bank and the people who live there. I will say there's kind of a funny, sad little anecdote here, which is that many readers of the book will likely be surprised and perhaps even upset to learn that for the first 20 years or so, or 19 years of Israel's existence, it set up laws that extended military law over Arab citizens of Israel. We're talking about people who were granted citizenship, Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, as many call themselves today, Arab Israelis, as they're also called, who did not flee or who were not expelled from their homes, as 750,000 Palestinians were. They either fled in fear or were kicked out by the new Israeli army. They stayed in Israel proper. And until mid-late 1967, 66, excuse me, those people lived under military governance. Now, it was done by region, so it wasn't done by ethnic or racial identity. But if you lived in certain areas, i.e. the areas where the majority of the population was Arab in Israel, you were under a military governor during Israel's existence. Then that was finally ended in 66, and in June 67, Israel conquers all the territory and all of these millions of people come under Israeli rule. So some say Israel was a full democracy for less than a year. That period between the end of martial law for Arab citizens in 66 and the occupation and settlement enterprise, which begins in 67. When it comes to the A word, apartheid. Look, the problem is I can't answer it in a soundbite. So when people say, is Israel an apartheid state or not? What I have to say is Israel within the borders of Israel proper, within the Green Line, is not an apartheid state. Israel, the rule Israel has extended over the West Bank and East Jerusalem looks a lot like some of the more pernicious aspects of apartheid. And what do you do with that? It's, you know, the Israeli government controls both of those territories. One of those territories, you could be the most cynical, Israel critical, left-wing supporter of the BDS movement. But if you went and you were really open-minded and truly intellectually honest and spent 2 weeks walking up and down the length and breadth of the state of Israel, meeting with Jews and Arabs and different kinds of Jews and civilians and government officials and judges and doctors and civil society and artists, and you really saw the whole panoply of modern Israeli society, you saw that there was a Supreme Court, an Arab Israeli Supreme Court justice. Until the last election, the third largest political party in Israel was an Arab majority party. During COVID, the ranks of doctors, nurses, and pharmacists is way overrepresented by Arab Israelis, saving their fellow citizens. So you'd have to conclude, if you were intellectually honest, that what you saw was not apartheid. If you gave me a group of similarly intellectually honest, open-minded, right-wing advocates and defenders of Israel, and you let me take them up and down the length and breadth of the West Bank for 2 weeks, and they saw settlers and Palestinians and soldiers and checkpoints between not just Israel and the territories, but also between Palestinian population centers in the territories, and Palestinians relegated to Area A, which makes up a tiny fraction, about 14 or so percent of the territory of the West Bank, but where 90% of the population lives, surrounded by Israeli-controlled territory. If they saw the inequitable distribution of resources like electricity and water and land, the rejection of building permits for Palestinian Arabs, and while they're approved for Israeli Jews in Area C, which is about 60% of the West Bank, which is totally controlled by Israel, which contains, you know, most of the water, most of the natural wealth of the country, of the territory, and all because of an immutable characteristic of birth, right? All because you were born an Arab and I was born a Jew. I have, even though I don't live in the state of Israel, I live in occupied territory, right? Israelis call it Judea and Samaria, the biblical names, but even the government of Israel, of Bibi Netanyahu, as we just said, has not annexed that territory. And I live as a settler with all the rights and privileges of an Israeli citizen. I vote in elections. I am tried in civil courts. I drive on Israeli-only roads and tunnels into my job in Israel. And you, right, an Arab resident of the same place, you don't have the same civil rights and liberties. You don't vote in those elections. If you are arrested by the Israelis, you're tried in a military court. So it looks a lot like what apartheid looked like. Now, that is obviously not a soundbite. It took me 3 or 4 minutes to do that whole thing. And that's why I think part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to have an intelligent conversation and unpack serious things in a thoughtful way without resorting to the sort of talking points of one of the two sides of the conflict.
I get that. The one challenge you have, or I think one of the challenges you have, is American politics is beginning to reflect, or does reflect, so that the Israeli politics, and in particular, although in my adult lifetime, the change in the discourse about Israel has changed. Part of that is like organizations like yours, J Street and others that are beginning to reflect, I think, a greater diversity of opinion within the U.S. Population here. Is that that's your day job? Like, are you experiencing that as well? That there is a greater sense, I don't want to say sympathy towards the Palestinians, that's the wrong word. It is just a greater sense that the Israel that our generation, that your generation of Jewish Americans was raised on, even if it did exist at the time, which is arguable,
right,
is really hard to defend, and in particular defend to our children who are being raised in a world of occupy and breaking down institutions and, you know, and disruption as a way of being, right?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that, unlike my previous answer, is a simple absolutely yes. It's becoming much harder And again, the book is an attempt to try to give people some tools to navigate this. But if, there's an analogy that we can use, like the way that American history was taught to our parents, right? People who were in grade school in the 50s and who sort of like, you talked about the war between the states. It was not the war to end slavery. You didn't look at the treatment of what happened, what we did to Native Americans or how we treated Black Americans, right? We like glossed over the fact that women couldn't vote in this country until the 1920s, right? So what happened in the decades after that, and by the time you and I were in grade school in the 70s, was that we were taught a sort of a warts and all history of the United States, and in part the reaction to that, the furious reaction to that, is what powers the Trumpist movement, right? Like the people who don't want to look at America changing and don't want to confront America's past. And that's a total parallel to what's happening with Israel. In Israel, there are historians who were known as the revisionist historians, which is confusing because revisionism was also a brand of right-wing Zionism back in the early days. But these historians basically were the analog to the historians in America who said, look, let's study what actually happened with all of these problems in American history. It doesn't mean that you are suddenly anti-American to acknowledge and recognize the attempted genocide of the native peoples of this continent, right? You're just learning the real history of what happened. It doesn't mean you're anti-American if you understand that for some Black Americans, celebrating the 4th of July feels pretty hollow, because that holiday celebrates a moment when they were not given the same privileges and rights as everybody else in the country. And what I think the intelligent approach to Israel is sort of, because you're asking specifically about our kids, right? Your kids and my kids, these Jewish teenagers growing up, right? Like teaching them the history of Israel, warts and all, is a way of actually giving them tools to build a normal, positive relationship, even though it's going to be complex and it will not be predicated on propaganda or hasbara, as we say in Hebrew, but actually might give people a sense of why Jews feel such tremendous PTSD. Like there's a lot of good reasons for it, and might give people a sense of why Palestinians will remain heartbroken forever, right? And why the only just resolution of this conflict is a compromise that recognizes the pain and rights of both peoples. But we can't get there without the reckoning, without recognizing that other story. The challenge is, like, by so many in the establishment in the Jewish world, I'm sorry to say, even in the political establishment, refusing to have that conversation and sticking to the circa 1950s America playbook about what Israel is. And, don't, like, any criticism of Israel is wrong and may even be anti-Semitic is too often the message, right? From people who say, no, criticism of Israel is fine, they say. But God forbid, Ben and Jerry should say, well, okay, so we want to sell our ice cream in Israel, but not in the Israeli settlements. You're anti-Semitic, say, the powers that be. So, that is a problem. And our kids are way too smart, right, to not see the hypocrisy there.
Right. I mean, in some ways, the Ben and Jerry debate was a great moment in the horrible moments, in the way horrible moments can be,
right,
in the sense that everyone can see I'm trying to battle the New England sun here. I forgot to put my shades down.
Did you just say the New England sun?
Yeah.
That's pretty funny.
Well, we try over here. Here we
You're
go.
in California, the sun knows what it's supposed to do.
It's like 4:30, 4:45. Is that was a bad brand to go after. I mean, in other words, they I don't want to say they won, but they didn't get killed. And 20 years ago, a brand that tried to do that probably would have, and even 15 years ago.
Well, so, even a couple of years ago, with Airbnb, which walked back. Now we'll see what Ben and Jerry's and Unilever are going to do. There are now in Arizona and New Jersey and a few other states, there are anti-boycott against Israel laws, which have thus far, when challenged by the ACLU and others, they've been struck down as unconstitutional when they try to prevent individuals from expressing their opinion about Israel by saying, if you support a boycott of Israel, you can't get a state job in Texas, which is blatantly unconstitutional. New Jersey saying it's going to pull its investments out of Unilever. We'll see how that one goes. But you're right. Thus far, Ben and Jerry's hasn't backed down, and I think we're only going to see more of that.
Okay, so I want to get to some questions. I'm going to end with lots of congratulations and stuff, but I want a couple questions about sort of okay, we get it. We are there with you. Has to, but how does that happen in Israel? Like, in other words, like, give us the good news now. Like, give us opportunity. A bunch of people have asked questions, and sorry, I'm not going to call out your names, but questions about sort of the get it. And the other thing, and someone did raise an interesting point, which I do think is worth you addressing, which is, let me just find it. It's from an anonymous attendee, but just that the Palestinians also have agency, and they've done things that do threaten the Israeli citizens, not just threaten them, harm them, and threaten the sense that you could have stability. So we got a chicken and an egg problem, I think, also. So.
Yeah, can I just say, Reboot, in your wisdom, if there's a way for you to get me screen, like I'd love to see the chat. I can see them flashing on the screen for a second, but the chat and the Q&A, if there's any way to preserve them, I'd love to see them, and I can try to.
Oh, good, yeah.
I'd be happy to sort of send some answers to Reboot to other questions. But of the ones that you asked, look, of course, Palestinians have agency as well. And, you know, Abba Eban, famously, paraphrase him, you know, former Israeli foreign minister, said the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And there is some truth to that, although, you know, there's truth to that as applied to many parties in this conflict, but also the Palestinians. I would only say, and I say this as a person who probably doesn't need saying, but I'll say it anyway. Yeah. I reject and abhor any terrorism, no matter, or violence, no matter who is perpetrating it, right? But the Palestinians, I think it's important to say, like, from our perspective, reading the paper here in the United States or wherever you are sitting, the power balance may seem very different from what it actually is on the ground in Israel, Palestine, where the Palestinians have virtually no power, and the Israelis hold almost all the cards. And we can argue that back and forth. And certainly the power of terror and violence is a very real power, but it's not an existential power that threatens Israel existentially. So there is, to say there's a power imbalance between the Israelis and the Palestinians is a radical understatement. You know, I will also say I saw something flash across the screen about BDS. So, you know, I personally don't support the BDS movement as it's construed right now, focusing on Israel for any number of reasons that we can get, well, for a few reasons. But I have a lot of sympathy, but I have a lot of sympathy for people who are asking themselves, okay, I want to oppose the occupation and the settlement enterprise. I agree that terrorism and violence is abhorrent and off limits. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to try to apply economic, cultural, academic, intellectual, military, well, not military, but aid pressure on Israel. And the idea, we villainize the letters BDS in the Jewish community, but, you know, there was a boycott of the Montgomery bus system, right, back in the day from the civil rights movement. And we sanction bad state actors all the time, like Iran and others. And we divest from, look, you know, when Indiana and North Carolina passed or threatened to pass anti-LGBTQ laws, major league and college sports leagues said we won't do business with you anymore. When Arizona refused to recognize MLK Day as a national holiday, you know, the federal government said we're going to withhold your highway money. So these are perfectly legitimate, really good tactics. And like as you heard, I don't have a problem when Ben and Jerry's says we are, you can call that a boycott if you want. I don't know quite what it is. I would say they're divesting themselves from the settlements. Right. I think that is I think that's a smart way of trying to influence things. It's obviously symbolic. They're not going to change policy that way. But I think what they're saying is we support Israel. We like Israel proper. We don't like your settlements. You know, we're not going to sell stuff in them. When the European Union says our law is meaningful differentiation, meaning you cannot label, Israel's largest trading partner is the EU, and it's got most favored nation trade status with the European Union. It's an affiliated member of the EU. But the EU says, we have a law that says you can't call products that come from your settlements, from Israeli settlements, you can't label them made in Israel. They have to be labeled made in Israeli settlements. Like, interestingly, they're allowed to be sold in EU supermarkets. You just can't call them made in Israel. And the EU says, this is because we want to signal to the Israeli population that we see a difference and we do want to pressure Israel to change its policies. And when they unveiled this strategy, a former Israeli ambassador to the US, who was then serving in a cabinet position in one of the Netanyahu governments, a guy called Michael Oren, originally from Philly, right? He said, that's just like what the Germans did to the Jews in the 1930s. And my friend, like the current president of Israel, a man I respect and like very much, called Ben and Jerry's economic terrorism. So that out of control, totally false, right, and hyperbolical response to people trying to say, hey, Israel, we like you, we don't like your settlements, is I think something that we have to call out. I don't want to lose the chance to talk about the hope, and you asked about that.
Yeah, so we got a few more minutes, so let's give you a chance for hope. Can I just before you guys, or maybe as part of this, because there's a bunch of questions on this, is I think one of the reasons, so there's a reason why an Arab American, despite the fact of my personal life and my children's path, would answer this no, because of the tension between Arabs, the Arab countries, and there's tension is a euphemism, everyone, I realize that, is one of the reasons why lots of Jewish Americans would answer no is because they are called, Jew-hating Jews, or, anti-Semitic themselves. Like it's not just the outward context, it is actually a sense internally that terminology can be used against those pushing for a more progressive, more inclusive Israel. So maybe that does get to the hope.
Yeah, I mean, look, it certainly is used that way, but that shouldn't bother us that much. We have to sort of move on and recognize that, you get called names when you try to. I was on a podcast with a rather curmudgeonly podcaster who said, one thing about your book that I find a little irritating is that you bend over backwards to be so even-handed and balanced, and you keep saying that both sides have reasonable claims. And I wanted to say, like, guilty as charged, right? Yeah. So, so it irritated him. Okay, that's what I think we need to be hearing. The hope, I'll give you two quick examples. One may not be particularly convincing for a lot of you listening, although I hope or watching, but I hope you'll consider it. One is that just as in our country here in the US, Israel's polity exists on a knife's edge. By the way, this is one of the reasons why I choose not to endorse BDS as a tactic right now, even though I oppose its criminalization and et cetera, et cetera. And we saw in the last election that Israel, like America, can tilt right a certain way and better things can happen. That's not a guarantee that it will happen, but the current government of Israel is not just sort of like a less than Bibi alternative to Bibi. It is a Frankenstein's monster of a coalition that somehow has come to life. It is made up of right-wing, centrist, left-wing, and Arab parties, right? This is a unique first in Israeli history. There's a friend of ours, of New Israel Funds. We have our big gala, our big Guardian of Democracy event this coming Sunday. If you're interested, go on our website, nif.org, and sign up. But one of the speakers is the second Arab Israeli minister, a guy whose family members were killed in a terrible massacre of Arab citizens of Israel years and years ago in Kfar Qassam. And the grandson of this guy who was killed is now, wait for it, the Minister of Regional Cooperation for Israel and a member of the Meretz party, the left-wing party in Israel, one of the left-wing parties in Israel. So like, that's a case for hope right there. The transportation minister and leader of the Labor Party is Israel's leading feminist. And there are a number of these examples of people in powerful positions in this weird government who represent a different kind of policy and different kinds of priorities, and who also serve as a check on the most avaricious desires of the hard right, even as the right-wing members of the coalition serve as a check on their more moderate instincts. But the second reason is the last chapter in the book, which I call The Case for Hope. And there I hand the mic over, to three activists, one a Palestinian citizen of Israel, one a Sudanese refugee, the first person to get refugee status in Israel, who came to Israel because he thought a Jewish country would give refuge to someone suffering from a genocide in Darfur, who now devoted his life to being an immigrant rights activist for other people seeking asylum, and a 60-something-year-old Orthodox Jewish guy who started an organization that stands in solidarity with people who have been victimized in the sectarian part of the conflict. When Palestinian terrorists go after Jews, when Jewish terrorists go after Palestinians, these guys show up, stand in solidarity, and say religious Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and say not in our name. So, like, if you can't find hope in those examples, then you are made of more cynical stuff than I am.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm gonna hand it back to Reboot and Francine, but I just want to say, I was monitoring your questions. I try to sort of merge them together. You know, one of the good things is teaching. I can actually do that, and the chat. There was such a rigorous, rich, deep, controversial, challenging series of questions. So I want to thank all of you for your patience. And I'm sorry if I couldn't get to all the questions, but also finally to Daniel for a thoughtful, honest discussion about your work, but also, of course, about the book. So thank you so much for the honor of hosting your big event. Or I wasn't hosting, I was moderating. But
well, thank you for doing it, and thank you
for the host. I turn over to the host. Thank you.
Juliette, Daniel, thank you so much. Daniel, congratulations. We are so excited. The Q&A was blowing up, the chat was blowing up. There is so much to talk about. And having had the privilege of seeing this book, buy it, so many of these conversations are in there. As you can see, Daniel is not afraid to go there, to go to those places in the conversation that people are afraid to do, that Juliette's dinner table shuts down over, that my dinner table shuts down over. This is the thing. Daniel, we are so grateful that you wrote this book, that we can all talk about it. And we will do our best to try and answer your questions. We'll get them to you, Daniel.
Great.
Next week, we have tons more great Reboot conversations coming up because we're not afraid to dive into those complicated conversations. So go to our website to sign up for that. We have Jillian Laub and Dr. Orna Goralnik talking about a very complicated family that somehow makes it through dinner.
Yeah.
And we are rescoring the golem. So you've all been waiting 100 years for that. We're doing that for you. Thank you all so much. Juliette, Daniel.
Thank you.
All.
Congratulations.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.